The bioviolet sphere expanded, pulsing with a heat that the Academy's containment field could no longer subtract. Not from a furnace did this warmth come, but from the girl's own calloused palms. Crimson alarms bled across the sterile floor, turning the white alloys of the chamber the color of a fresh wound. Nova didn't blink. Through the flickering light of the safety suppressors, an outcome Kale had failed to calculate. She simply watched the glass grow. A sharp metallic snap. The dampening ring above her head fractured into crystalline dust. What Nova did to that machine? It's a warning for anyone trying to cage a human. You'll want to see how this ends. Trust me on that. That same smell of scorched silicon. It had first filled Overseer Kale's vents 4 cycles ago, back when the domestication of Subject Nova was still considered a flawless success. High above the obsidian floors of the central spire, the air tasted of ozone and sterile filtration. No dust was permitted here, for dust represented the chaos of the outer worlds, the friction of existence, that the Academy sought to rectify. Through the vast transparency of the observation deck, the gas giant Calpurnius hung like a bloated eye, casting a sickly green light across the proctor's consoles. Kale adjusted his ocular filters. He was an archvi, a student of sentient behavior who believed that any wild thing could be tamed with enough precision and the right academic curriculum. In the center of the containment ring sat the human, a creature named Nova. She was 17 Earth years old, a detail Kale found irrelevant until he saw her hands. They were small but mapped with the geography of labor, the skin toughened by a life spent in the dirt of a frontier colony. Resting beside her was the scarred leather glove, its surface blackened by soot and smelling of old earth smoke. It was a filthy, archaic object that clashed with the pristine white alloys of the Academy. Kale had offered her a thermal link weave, a garment that would regulate her temperature with subatomic accuracy, but she had refused it with a silent, terrifying shake of her head. To understand Nova was to understand the glass. Silica, when heated to the melting point of 1500 degrees, becomes a chaotic dance of amorphous molecules. It is neither solid nor liquid. It is a material that requires constant motion to maintain its shape, much like the humans themselves. The Academy used this as a metaphor for domestication. If they could teach a human to focus their destructive energy into the delicate tension of a glass vessel, the predatory spark would eventually fade into artistic submission. Nova stood. She did not rise with the fluid grace of the alien species, but with a series of micro-adjustments. She shifted her weight from her left heel to the ball of her right foot, her toes gripping the deck plates as if checking for seismic stability. Kale watched this behavior for the 10th time that cycle, logging it as a chronic human inability to find a comfortable resting posture. He did not realize she was calibrating her center of gravity for an explosive movement that her ancestors called a lunge. Under the watchful nodes of the proctor, the shaping began. Nova reached for the long steel blowpipe and dipped it into the glowing crucible. Into the molten vat she dipped the rod, her movements heavy with a false fatigue that Kale interpreted as the crushing weight of Academy discipline. He watched her biometric graph spikes. A film of saltwater moisture began to coat her forehead, stinging her eyes until she blinked rapidly. Kale recorded this as a biological leak, a failure of her thermal regulation systems under the mild psychological pressure of the task, a typical human frailty, the biological cost of existing on a planet that never wanted them. He felt a flicker of pity for a species so poorly engineered for the high-intensity environments of the galaxy, unaware that her heart was currently pumping blood at a rate that would have ruptured the vessels of any other creature in the room. She was overclocking. She was a predator waiting for the cage door to click. Came the first sign of the fracture. A high-pitched keen, like the screech of metal on metal, began to emanate from the containment ring's primary capacitors. The glass sphere at the end of Nova's pipe was no longer the color of honey. It had turned a bruised, electric violet, a shade that suggested the molecular bonds of the silica were being rewritten by a heat source the Academy sensors couldn't locate, the violent rewriting of physics. The proctor's console flashed a warning. The temperature in the room was rising, not because of the furnace, but because the girl's own biology was beginning to bleed energy into the environment. Subject Nova, withdraw the pipe immediately. Kale's voice echoed, distorted by the static of a failing speaker, the sound of order turning into static. The power dynamic in the room shifted as the green light of the gas giant outside was eclipsed by the violet pulse of the glass. Nova didn't move. She only tightened her grip on the scarred leather glove until the old leather creaked under her fingers. The containment ring's humming escalated into a rhythmic throb, a sound that resonated in the hollow of Kale's chest cavity. Nova's breathing had become a series of jagged, rhythmic gasps. To the Proctor's sensors, the human's core temperature was now a statistical impossibility. No carbon-based lifeform could sustain such heat without its cellular membranes dissolving into a slurry of proteins and failed intentions. Kale reached for the emergency override, his long, translucent fingers hovering over the glass-blue kill switch. He waited, held back by a perverse academic curiosity. He wanted to see the exact microsecond when the human domestication process hit its thermal limit and the subject finally surrendered. Within the girl's mind, the sterile white of the academy had long since burned away. Nova wasn't in a vacuum-sealed chamber anymore. Beneath the scorched smell of the academy, she tasted the dry, iron-rich dust of the Earth's Mojave. She remembered the way the heat used to shiver off the horizon, a shimmering veil that hid the rattlesnakes and the scavengers. Toby, only 9 years old then, would wait by the workshop door with a cracked ceramic cup of well water. He never asked why she spent 10 hours a day at the furnace, bending the molten silica until her eyes turned the color of sunset. He only knew that when Nova was at the pipe, the world was exactly the shape she wanted it to be. The memory of that cold ceramic against her fingers was the only anchor she had left as the Academy's suppressors tried to rewrite her nervous system. The subject's metabolic exhaust is reaching critical thresholds, the automated voice of the spire announced. Not a warning of pain was this, but a statement of atmospheric failure. The Academy's cooling systems were designed to handle the heat of the furnace, not the localized sun that Nova was becoming. Kale watched the saltwater moisture, what the humans called sweat, soaking through her tunic. He still saw it as a sign of a failing engine, a leak in a poorly pressurized system. Nova tilted her chin, checking the horizontal alignment of the blowpipe against a faint, diagonal seam in the floor plating. It was a routine adjustment, the kind of boring habit a glassblower performs 1,000 times a day to ensure the weight is centered. She didn't look like a revolutionary. She looked like a tired laborer performing a mundane check of her tools. Across the chamber, the hidden layer of her movements finally converged. The weight-shifting Kale had logged as restlessness was gone. Nova had found her center. Every micro-adjustment of her heels and forearms had been a calibration, a slow-motion tensioning of a biological spring. She wasn't just standing. She was anchored into the very bones of the station. The science of the Academy was based on the domesticated variable. They believed that humans were Tier 4 creatures because they required massive amounts of energy to perform simple tasks. What Kale finally saw in the readouts was the inverse of his training. A predatory metabolic surge is not a failure of cooling. It is the deliberate redirection of every joule of energy into a single kinetic burst. Humans didn't leak heat because they were inefficient. They leaked it because their bodies were high-performance engines meant to operate at a redline that would melt a machine. Shattered came the final surge. The bioviolet sphere at the end of the pipe reached its maximum diameter. Nova exhaled, a long, controlled release of air that should have been impossible for lungs so scorched by the ambient heat. The violet glass didn't just break. It detonated. It wasn't the pressure of her breath that did it, but the frequency of her focus. The Academy's containment ring, built from the strongest alloys in the sector, turned to liquid fire as Nova's kinetic energy bypassed the dampers. Inside the ruin of the chamber, Kale sat paralyzed. His ocular filters were cracked. The green light of the gas giant outside was a dull blur, obscured by the haze of ionized dust. The machines had broken. The domesticator had been outpredated by the subject. Through the smoke, Nova stood among the shards of the Academy's pride. She wasn't Tier 4. She was something older, something the stars had forgotten to be afraid of until today. Cale looked at his monitors. All the data was there, the records of her sweat and her struggle, but it read like a different language now. The correction hit him with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't been failing the test. She had been testing the cage to see how hard she had to hit it to make it vanish. "Is the lesson complete, Proctor?" Nova asked. Her voice was steady, the tremors in her hands completely gone. She held the scarred leather glove, the archaic scrap Cale had mocked, and pulled it onto her hand. The leather was charred, the stitching undone by the heat, but it fit her like a second skin. Behind the girl, the vacuum of space began to hiss through the microfractures in the viewing deck. The Academy's classification of humanity as subservient was being purged from the system by the sheer heat of her presence. Nova walked toward the exit, her footsteps heavy and deliberate on the scorched metal. Cale did not move to stop her. Behind him, the violet sphere had left a permanent shadow burned into the white wall of the chamber. The leather glove lay abandoned on the cooling floor. Smoke rose in thin, gray ribbons from the charred fingertips. Outside the glass, the green light of Calpurnius glinted off a single, sharp fragment of violet glass. Nova stepped over the threshold into the dark corridor. The red emergency lights turned her shadow into a long, jagged blade.